I have died once already, and I remember it the way you remember drowning, not the water itself, but the moment just before when you already know no one is coming. They called it a boating accident on the ornamental lake behind our own house, and by the time it happened, there was almost no one left to grieve it properly. My brothers were already ruined or dead, or worse than dead by then, one after another, over the span of a single terrible year, and I was the last loose thread of a family someone very powerful had decided needed cutting. I remember the specific cold of that water more clearly than I remember most of that year, which is its own kind of mercy, I suppose, that the mind keeps the smaller, sharper pain and lets the larger, duller grief blur at the edges. I remember boatmen I had trusted since childhood suddenly not being at the oars when the boat tipped, and I remember thinking, in the strange calm that sometimes visits the last moments of a thing, that I had spent that whole final year asking careful questions no one wanted answered, and that someone, somewhere had finally decided I had asked one question too many. I do not remember dying so much as I remember the specific quality of being alone in it. My mother had already been ill for months by then. My father had aged a decade in a single year, and 4 of my 5 brothers were scattered or broken or estranged. Only Piers, the youngest, had still written to me every week, faithful in a way none of the rest of us had the strength left to be, and it is his handwriting, oddly, more than my own drowning, that I remember most vividly from the last days of that first life, small, careful letters from a boy trying, uselessly, to hold together a family that had already come apart around him. I open my eyes in my own bed, 16 instead of 22, and the first thing I know before I know my own name again, before I remember which season it is that all 5 of my brothers are in danger, and that I have perhaps 3 days before the first of them is lost to it forever. It comes to me in pieces, not all at once, the way frost climbs a window from the corners inward, but the shape of the danger arrives faster than the details, the way you can feel a storm coming before you can name which direction it will strike from. Bastian, my eldest brother, will be blamed for cowardice at the border within the week, a false charge that will end his commission and very nearly his life. Fenwick, my second brother, will have his examination thesis quietly replaced with a plagiarized copy the night before he is meant to defend it. Rendel, my third brother, will be lured into a rigged game of dice at a den he has no business visiting and buried under a debt meant to make him desperate enough to be useful to someone else. Ashby, my fourth brother, will be caught in a manufactured scandal with a married noblewoman that will cost him his position at court and his good name besides. And Piers, my youngest brother, barely 17, will be turned by patient, poisonous flattery against the rest of us entirely, groomed over months to believe his own family stands between him and everything he deserves. I lie very still in the dark after the last of it settles into place, and I think, someone is dismantling this family one brother at a time, and they have been doing it for a reason, not for cruelty's own sake, and I intend to find out what that reason is before it costs me a single one of them twice. Our house sits along the Northern March, a marshal's household in service to the Crown for 4 generations, and my father, Lord Harwin Kestrel, has always said that loyalty is easy to preach and expensive to practice, which is perhaps why our family has practiced so much of it and profited so little. My mother, Lady Delia, keeps the household with the same brisk fairness she brought to raising 6 children who fought like wolves and closed ranks like a shield wall the moment any of us was threatened from outside. I have 5 brothers because my mother wanted a daughter badly enough to try 6 times, and got one, at last wedged in exactly the middle of the line, with 2 brothers older and 3 younger, all of us raised half wild in a house too full of boys for anyone to enforce much decorum. Each of them is entirely unlike the others, in the way siblings raised close together often become, as if determined from the cradle not to be mistaken for one another. Bastian has always been the steady one, unimaginative in exactly the way a good officer needs to be, more comfortable giving an order than explaining the feeling behind it. Fenwick is the quiet scholar among us, happiest with a book propped against a teapot, the only one of my brothers who ever had the patience to teach me my letters properly, rather than simply telling me to hurry up and learn them. Rendel has always run a little too fast toward whatever looked most like fun, generous to a fault and reckless in exactly the way generous men often are, unable to imagine that anyone might take advantage of an openness he has never once withheld from anybody. Ashby is the closest thing our family has to a diplomat, careful of appearances in a way the rest of us have never quite managed, which made it all the crueler the first time that his own careful reputation was the very thing turned against him. And Piers was always the one left holding the door after the rest of us had already run through it. 7 years younger than Bastian and never quite certain, growing up whether he had been born into this family or merely tolerated by it. We had a game as children, all 6 of us, played on rainy days when the northern weather kept us indoors, a leather dice cup, worn soft and dark with handling, and 5 old dice inside it, one for each of my brothers, and a rule Bastian invented when he was 10 that has outlasted every other rule of our childhood. No one may touch another player's throw. The dice remember fair play, he used to say, solemn as a judge, even when men forget it. Whoever cheated the dice cup, in our house, cheated something older and steadier than any of us, and it was treated, half in jest and half in genuine family religion, as the one sin none of us was ever permitted to commit against each other. I think of that rule on the 3rd morning of my second life, watching Rendel saddle a horse for an evening I already know leads to a card table he has no business sitting at, and I understand, all at once, that someone outside this family has decided the dice cup's old rule does not apply to them. My mother notices before any of my brothers do, because mothers notice everything eventually, even the things their children take the most trouble to hide. She finds me standing too long at my window on the 2nd morning and asks, in the mild, unhurried tone she has always used for questions she intends to have answered eventually, whether I answer them at once or not, whether something is troubling me. I keep thinking something terrible is about to happen, I tell her, which is as close to the whole truth as I dare come this early. To the boys, I can't explain it better than that. She studies me the way she studies a bolt of cloth before committing to a cut. Unhurried, thorough, missing nothing. Your grandmother used to have feelings like that, she says finally, which startles me, because I had not known that in this life or the one before it. Before your grandfather's accident at the mill, she swore for a week beforehand that something was wrong with the wheel, and no one listened, because there was nothing to point to yet. I have never forgotten how right she turned out to be, nor how little good it did her that she'd known early, since she couldn't make anyone else believe it in time. She takes my hand. Whatever you're feeling, Win, don't wait for proof before you act on it. Proof can be gathered after. Some warnings only work if you're early. It is, I think afterward, the single most useful piece of advice anyone gives me in the whole of that year. And it comes not from careful investigation or cipher work, but from a mother who has learned, the hard way, that a household survives on trusting its women's instincts before the ledgers and letters ever catch up to confirm them. I go to Bastian first because his danger arrives soonest. He is 24, solid and unimaginative in exactly the way a cavalry officer should be, and he laughs at me, kindly, the way an eldest brother laughs at a younger sister's fears when I tell him, as carefully as I can manage without sounding like I have lost my wits, that I have had a very bad feeling about the border patrol he is due to lead in 4 days' time. You've never once cared what patrol I lead, he says, not unkindly. What's brought this on, Win? A dream, I say, which by now feels less like a lie every time I say it, and more like the truest word I have for what is actually happening to me. I dreamed you were blamed for something you didn't do. Cowardice, Bastian, in front of the whole company. Something flickers across his face. Not belief. Not yet, but the particular unease of a soldier who has spent enough years in service to know that reputation dies faster than a man does, and can be killed by a rumor a coward never has to actually prove. There's no cause for anyone to say such a thing of me. There doesn't need to be a cause, I tell him. Only an opportunity, and someone patient enough to arrange one. He does not believe me outright, but he agrees, to humor me, to take Commander Thaddeus Bell fully into his confidence about the patrol's route beforehand, rather than leaving the particulars to a junior officer as he ordinarily would. A small change, The kind that costs nothing and asks for nothing, except that it means when a supply wagon is found abandoned at the border 2 days later, its guard vanished and its cargo of grain missing, with a note planted among Bastian's own gear suggesting he had been bribed to let it pass unchallenged. Commander Bell can say, without hesitation, exactly where Bastian was and was not during the hours in question, because he had personally reviewed the route with him beforehand and knows the timeline does not fit. It is not proof of a conspiracy yet, it is only a single thread pulled loose, but a single thread, pulled early enough, is sometimes all that keeps a whole cloak from unraveling. Fenwick is harder, because scholars do not believe in dreams the way soldiers half do, out of long habit of trusting a commander's instinct over a private's certainty. I have to be cleverer with him, so I ask, instead of warning him outright, whether he keeps a second copy of his examination thesis anywhere but his own writing desk. Why would I need a second copy? Because papers left in only one place have a way of being interfered with, I say. And you have worked on that thesis for 2 years. Fenwick, I would hate to see 2 years undone by a night's carelessness that wasn't even your own. He humours me the way Bastian did, more out of fondness for a sister he has always found strange and stubborn than out of any real fear, and copies the whole thesis out again in his own hand, sealing the copy in our father's strongbox rather than leaving it in his rooms. When the original is found, 4 nights later, altered in 3 places to closely mirror a published disputation from a decade past, enough to constitute a ruinous accusation of plagiarism, had it been the only copy in existence, Fenwick is able to produce, calmly before the examining board, a sealed and witnessed second copy, proving the alterations could only have been made by someone with access to his rooms after the honest draft was already finished. Rendel is the brother I like least to think about, because I remember in the fragments still sharpening at the edges of my memory exactly how deep his ruin went the first time, and exactly how little any of us understood, until it was too late, that a man does not simply wander into a den full of weighted dice by his own poor judgment alone. Someone had spent months cultivating his taste for exactly that kind of company. I cannot forbid him from going. Rendel has never in his life responded well to being forbidden anything, so instead I ask Steward Purdy, quietly, to have someone reliable watch the particular den on the address I already uneasily half remember, and it is Purdy himself in the end who recognizes old Fitch, the den's keeper, as a man who has done exactly this kind of work before, for coin, for men who preferred their enemies self-ruined rather than obviously murdered. When Rendel sits down to a game 3 nights later, Purdy's watchman is already outside, and it is a simple matter, once Rendel has lost enough to grow suspicious of his own luck, for him to demand the dice be examined by an independent hand, rather than accepting old Fitch's smooth insistence that fortune simply was not with him that night. The waiting is clumsy once anyone actually looks for it, the way most cruelty is clumsy once someone finally bothers to look. Ashby's danger is the ugliest because it uses another person's reputation as the weapon, and I spend more sleepless nights over how to prevent it without simply ruining an innocent woman in his place than I do over any of my other brothers. Lady Seren Falk, I learn carefully through my mother's own household connections, is a young widow being quietly pressured by a debt she did not incur herself, inherited from a late husband's gambling, and someone has offered to forgive that debt in exchange for her cooperation in a scheme to be discovered, convincingly, in a compromising situation with my brother. I go to her directly, which is a risk, because I cannot yet prove any of what I suspect, and a wrong approach could see the whole trap sprung early out of simple panic. But I tell her plainly that I know she is being pressured, that I do not believe for one moment she wishes any of this, and that my family has resources enough to settle an inherited debt honestly, in exchange for nothing more than the truth, told to the right people at the right time, rather than staged for an audience someone else has chosen. She weeps when I say it, with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying a threat alone for months and had stopped believing anyone would offer her an honest way out of it. I did not want this, she tells me. I have never even properly spoken with your brother. I was told where to be and when, and warned what would happen to my late husband's family's name if I refused. Then don't be there when they expect you, I tell her. Be somewhere else entirely, with witnesses who can swear to it, and let whoever arranged this discover, for once, that the trap has no one standing inside it. Ashby, for his part, never even fully understands until much later how close he came to ruin. He remarks once that a garden supper he'd been invited to that autumn was strangely thin of company, and laughs it off as poor planning on his hostess's part, rather than the collapse of a trap built specifically around his own presence there. I let him believe that a while longer than I probably should, partly because the full truth would have humiliated him unnecessarily, and partly because I have learned, watching 4 other brothers absorb their own near misses that year, that a man survives a danger more easily when he does not have to also carry the full weight of how narrowly he escaped it. It is only after Lady Serenfalk's testimony before the assembly of banners that Ashby understands the whole of what had been arranged around him, and he comes to me afterward, ashen, and asks whether I had known that whole autumn precisely how close he had come. I suspected, I tell him honestly. I did not know for certain until Seren herself confirmed it. I am sorry I couldn't tell you outright at the time. I was afraid that if you knew, you might behave differently enough to spoil the very thing meant to protect you. He is quiet for a long moment. I would have wanted to know, he says. Even so, I know. I say, I chose wrong perhaps. I chose the version of wrong that kept you safe, rather than the version that kept you comfortable. I hope in time you'll forgive me the difference. He does eventually, and tells me so plainly enough, some years later, at his own wedding, that I stopped turning the exchange over in my mind at all. Rendel does not thank me for any of it at first. He is furious, in fact, for the better part of a week, humiliated at having been played for a fool by a den-keeper, and unwilling to admit that his own sister's meddling was the only reason his humiliation stopped there, rather than becoming a debt that would have followed him for years. It is only after Purdy quietly shows him the full extent of what the weighted dice would have cost him, laid out in plain numbers, that his fury curdles into something closer to gratitude delivered, in typical Rendel fashion, as a joke rather than a proper thank you. I suppose I owe you for not letting me ruin myself in front of the whole garrison, he tells me, not quite meeting my eyes. Try not to make a habit of rescuing me, Win. A man likes to think he's occasionally capable of managing his own affairs. Then manage them better, I tell him, and I won't need to. He laughs for the first time since the whole ugly business began, and it is the first moment I let myself believe that this brother, at least, might come out the other side of this year mostly whole. Piers is the one I fear most, and the one I am proudest of in the end, for reasons that have nothing to do with clever evidence and everything to do with simply refusing to let him go. He is 17, restless in the way youngest sons often are, certain that the rest of us have already claimed whatever glory or usefulness a family this size has to offer and left him nothing but scraps. It is not hard for someone patient to find that restlessness and press gently against it, month after month, until a young man begins to believe that the family holding him back is the same family he ought to resent. I cannot fight a feeling with an accusation, so instead I simply spend time with him, more than I ever did in my first life, when I was too busy being useful elsewhere to notice a younger brother quietly working loose from the rest of us. I ask him what he actually wants, rather than assuming I already know, and it turns out what he wants is something almost embarrassingly simple: to be trusted with something real, rather than protected from everything the way a family's youngest so often is. I bring that want to my father plainly, and Piers is given, for the first time, a genuine responsibility within the household rather than a courtesy title, and the poisonous flattery he had been quietly fed for months finds, when it is tested against an actual sense of belonging, far less purchase than it had counted on. I meet the man who had been cultivating him only once, briefly, at a market fair. Piers takes me to that same summer, proud of his new standing and eager, in the way of younger brothers, to show his sister off to whatever new acquaintances he has made. The man is pleasant, unremarkable, quick with a compliment, and quicker still with the particular kind of flattery that flatters a young man's grievances rather than his virtues. And I understand, watching him work, exactly how patiently and how well he had been doing his job before I ever arrived to interrupt it. I say nothing to alarm Piers that day. I only make certain, afterward, that Purdy's people keep a quiet watch on the man's comings and goings, and it is that same watch, months later, that helps confirm his connection to the very network Reeves' cipher eventually exposes in full. "You didn't trust him," Piers says to me once, much later, when the whole truth has finally come out. "From the very first afternoon I could see it on your face, and I resented you for it at the time." I didn't trust him. I agree, I trusted you. There's a difference, Piers, and I'm sorry it took me this long in either life to learn how to show it properly. By midsummer, all 5 threats have failed, one after another, in ways too varied and too specific to be coincidence. And I know, the way I have known everything else since I woke into this second life, that whoever arranged all of it will not simply give up because their first attempts went wrong. I am proven right within the month. My own rooms are searched, clumsily, while the household is at evening prayers. Nothing taken, but nothing quite where I left it either, and Purdy, examining the window latch the next morning, finds it forced from outside rather than picked from within. A week after that, a rider follows my carriage back from my mother's sister's house, a full 2 miles past the point any honest traveller would have turned off toward the market road, and only peels away once Damon, riding beside me by pure good fortune that day, makes plain that he has noticed. I say nothing of either incident to my father, who has enough to worry over already, but I tell Damon everything. And it is that evening, sitting together over a cold supper neither of us has much appetite for, that we agree the danger has stopped being about any one brother, and has become, plainly, about whoever has been trying to prevent this family from noticing the pattern at all. They know someone is interfering now, Damon says. Which means whatever comes next will be aimed at finding out who, before it's aimed at finishing what they started. Then we had better find them first, I say, and he does not argue, only reaches across the table and takes my hand, in the same steady, unhurried way he has done everything else since the day I first told him the truth. It is Master Osmond Reeve, our family's old cipher clerk, half retired and mostly forgotten in a small room off the eastern wing, who gives me the peace I still need. I go to him with a fragment of correspondence Purdy's watchman recovered from old Fitch's rooms after the Dice Den affair, a single sealed letter, never delivered, written in a cipher none of us can read, bearing no name at all, only a seal pressed in plain wax rather than a house's colours, as though whoever sent it wished very much not to be traced. This is an old court cipher, Reeve tells me, after 2 days spent with it, his eyes bright with the particular pleasure of an old man given, at last, a problem worth his remaining years. Used by the royal household's own correspondence clerks a generation back, before a simpler code replaced it. Whoever wrote this either served in that household once, or had access to someone who did. Decoded, the letter is a set of instructions, payment terms for the dice matter, a warning to be careful with the border matter, and a final line that stops my breath entirely. Continue as agreed regarding the kestrel matter. His Highness grows impatient for results before the succession council convenes. His Highness, I do not sleep at all that night. Prince Alden Ashvale is the king's younger son, 3 years past 30, and has spent his entire adult life in the particular bitterness of a man who was told, as a child, that he might one day be king, only to watch his elder brother Tavish grow into exactly the kind of steady, well-loved heir that makes a younger prince's ambitions look like envy rather than merit. Our family has never opposed him directly. My father has simply, consistently, thrown his loyalty behind the Crown Prince Tavish, as have most of the Northern March's other loyalist houses, and I understand now, reading Reeve's decoded letter a second time, that consistency was itself the offence. A succession council was coming. Prince Alden intended to arrive at it with the North's most powerful loyalist family already discredited, disgraced, or destroyed, so that whatever support they might have thrown behind his brother would simply no longer exist to be thrown. Our betrothal had been arranged 2 years before any of this began. In the ordinary way such things are arranged between 2 allied northern houses, and I remember, from the fragments of my first life, that I had liked Damon well enough then, without ever quite trusting him with anything that mattered. This time, within a week of waking into my second life, I test him, carefully, the way you test ice before committing your full weight to it, by telling him one small, verifiable piece of what I feared for Bastian, and watching, not what he says, but what he does with it. He does not laugh, he does not repeat to anyone, he simply asks, the very next morning, whether there is anything he can do to help without drawing attention to himself. And it is that quiet, unglamorous usefulness, offered before I had even asked for it, that convinces me more thoroughly than any declaration could have that I had misjudged him badly the first time around. I married Damon Vetch that autumn as planned, in a wedding neither of us tries to delay despite everything unfolding around it, because Damon, quiet, steady, cleverer than his own family gives him credit for, has been, since the very first week I told him the truth of what I suspected, exactly the kind of partner I did not know to hope for. He does not question my instincts the way my brothers fondly, still sometimes do. He simply asks what needs doing next, and does it. It is Damon who thinks to approach Commander Bell formally, once the cipher is decoded, and ask him to put his account of the border incident into a sworn statement rather than a private reassurance between officers. It is Damon who sits with Lady Seren Falk for the better part of an afternoon gently, patiently, until she agrees to testify formally rather than simply having quietly avoided the trap set for her. It is Damon, in the end, who suggests that a matter this large should not be settled in any private council chamber, where a prince's influence might still smooth it away, but before the full assembly of banners, the twice-yearly gathering of every loyalist house's sworn military strength, presided over by the king himself, where no single man's rank, however elevated, can entirely control the room. King Edmar Ashfell convenes the assembly early that year, at his own son Tavish's quiet urging. Once Reeves' decoded letter and the accumulated testimony have been laid before him in private, and he has had, I am told, a full night alone to absorb what his younger son has been doing in his name. The Assembly of Banners has never before heard a case quite like it. Commander Bell testifies first, plain and unshaken, that Bastian's movements on the day of the supply theft are fully accounted for, and could not possibly fit the timeline the planted evidence implied. Fenwick's examining board sends a formal deposition confirming the sealed second thesis predates the tampering by months. Old Fitch, arrested and given a choice between confessing plainly or facing the full weight of a fraud charge alone, names the agent who paid him readily enough once he understands his employer has no intention of protecting him. Lady Seren Falk speaks last among the witnesses, her voice steady despite how visibly it costs her, and describes precisely how she was pressured, and by whom, and what she was promised in exchange for her cooperation in a scheme against a man she had never wronged. Reeve himself is called last among the witnesses and explains in the patient tone of a man teaching a favorite subject to an unfamiliar audience exactly how the cipher works and why he is certain of the decoding, walking the assembled peers through the same old court cipher key line by line, so that no one in that hall can later claim the translation was invented rather than uncovered. My father sits through the entire proceeding with his hands folded and his face carefully still, and it is only afterward, when the hall has begun to murmur, that I see him reach for my mother's hand beneath the table, the first unguarded gesture I have seen from him in the whole long ordeal. Reeves' decoded letter is read aloud in full, the phrase His Highness grows impatient landing in that hall, with a silence so complete I can hear my own pulse in my ears. Prince Alden does not confess. He stands very straight, exactly the way I imagine a man stands who has spent his whole life being told he is nearly good enough and never quite believing it, and he says that a prince's private correspondence is not a commoner's business to intercept, cipher or no cipher, and that a family's misfortunes, however unlucky, are no proof of a royal conspiracy. It is his own brother who answers him. Crown Prince Tavish rises, and there is no triumph in his face at all. Only a tiredness that looks to me very much like grief. I have spent our whole lives making excuses for you, Alden, he says, because I believed, foolishly, that whatever you lacked in patience you made up for in loyalty to this family, if nothing else. I find I was wrong about the second part, and I am done pretending otherwise in front of men who deserve better from both of us. King Edmar's judgment, delivered the following week in a private council rather than before the full assembly a second time, strips Prince Alden of his place in the succession entirely and confines him to a remote holding in the kingdom's far west for the remainder of his life. Not executed, though the law would allow it, because the king says, plainly, that he has already lost one son to ambition in every way that matters, and does not intend to bury the other one as well, over a matter that can be settled with exile instead of a headsman. We ride home from the capital as a family for the first time in longer than I can remember. All 5 of my brothers crowded into and around 2 carriages meant comfortably for half that number, and there is a strange, giddy exhaustion to the whole journey, the particular relief of people who have spent a year braced for disaster and are only now, gradually allowing themselves to believe it has actually passed. Bastian falls asleep against the window before we have cleared the capital's outer gate. Fenwick spends the first 2 hours reading the same page of a book, without turning it. Rendel makes jokes no one quite has the energy to laugh at properly, and Ashby, uncharacteristically quiet, simply watches the road already, I think, working up the courage to call on Lady Falk properly, rather than merely thanking her from a careful distance. Piers falls asleep last, his head on my shoulder the way he used to, when he was small enough to fit there, and my father, watching the 2 of us from across the carriage, says nothing at all, but does not stop watching for a long while. The years that follow settle each of my brothers into a life I had not dared to hope any of them would keep. Bastian is given a border command of his own the following spring, his name cleared so thoroughly that Commander Bell jokes he will have to invent new gossip to keep the officers' mess entertained. He marries, some years later, the quiet daughter of a fellow officer, and writes to tell me, in the plainest possible language, that he has finally found someone he does not have to explain himself to, which from Bastian counts as a love letter. Fenwick passes his examinations with distinction and is invited 2 years later to help draft reforms to the very cipher systems that nearly ruined him, on the grounds that a man who has been the target of one conspiracy makes an unusually careful guardian against the next. He never marries, content instead to fill a modest house with books and, eventually, with a small flock of nieces and nephews who treat his study as a second nursery, a habit he complains about constantly and does nothing whatsoever to discourage. Rendel gives up dice entirely for almost a year out of sheer stubborn pride, then returns to the game only within our own family, where the old rule still holds. No one touches another player's throw, and says, more than once, that he has never once been tempted to break it again, having seen exactly what it costs when someone else does. He takes over the management of the Northern Marches horse fairs in Taijunta, a trade that rewards exactly the charm and easy generosity that once made him such an easy target, now spent on people who have no reason to abuse it. Ashby marries Lady Falk 2 years after the assembly, a match neither of their families quite expected, and both of them insist, laughing, was entirely their own idea and nothing at all to do with a scheme meant to ruin them both. I stand beside Seren at the wedding at her own particular request, and she tells me quietly, before the ceremony, that she had spent a full year afterward believing no honest man would ever look past what she had nearly been used for, until Ashby made a point patiently and repeatedly of proving her wrong. Piers is given, at 19, command of a modest garrison of his own, and writes to me every month without fail, in a hand grown steadier every year, to tell me about nothing in particular, because he has decided, he says, that a family worth trusting is also a family worth simply talking to. My father lives another 15 years past the assembly, long enough to see every one of his sons settled, and tells anyone who will listen, toward the end, that the Northern March bred 5 good sons and 1 better daughter. A joke my brothers pretend to be wounded by, and privately I know, do not dispute at all. My mother outlives him by only 2 winters, and spends them exactly as she always said she wanted to, surrounded by more grandchildren than she can keep straight by name, correcting all of our manners equally regardless of whose household we have since married into. My own children arrive slowly, the way most good things in my second life have arrived. A son first, 3 years into my marriage to Damon, who is solemn and watchful in exactly his father's manner, and a daughter after him, loud in exactly mine, who at 4 years old has already declared herself the rightful keeper of the old dice cup, over the vocal objections of 5 uncles, who each still believe, privately, that it ought to belong to them. We play the old game every winter still, all of us crowded into my parents' hall on the first hard snow. 6 siblings and 5 spouses, and a scattering of children too young to understand the rules and too stubborn to be kept from the table anyway. Bastian still recites the old rule every year, solemn as ever, though he has long since stopped needing to enforce it. No one touches another player's throw. The dice remember fair play, even when men forget it. Master Reeve comes every year too until his death, insisting each time that he only wants a quiet corner and a strong cup of tea, and staying invariably until the last dice have been thrown and the youngest children carried off to bed. Commander Bell visits when his postings allow it, and Lady Seren, Ashby's wife now in every sense that matters, the old formality of her title long since worn away by simple family fondness, keeps a running, good-natured wager with Rendel about whose children will inherit the dice cup first, a wager neither of them ever intends to collect on, since we all already know, without needing to say it, that the cup belongs to the whole family and always has. My father, in his last winter, watches the whole loud gathering from his chair by the fire and tells my mother, within my hearing, that he had once thought a house with 5 sons and 1 daughter was more blessing than a man could reasonably expect, and had not understood until that particular year nearly undid all of it, how much of that blessing depended on the 6 of us choosing, again and again, not to let anyone convince us we were each other's enemy, instead of each other's whole reason for holding on. I have never told any of my brothers the whole truth of what I remembered, the fall of that first year, the boating accident that ended it. I have told them enough, a very bad feeling, dreams too specific to ignore, and let the rest remain mine to carry. The way our grandmother's gloves in another life might have stayed one family's private inheritance rather than the whole kingdom's business. What I have told my own children, plainly, every winter by the fire, is the only part of it that matters going forward. That a family this size only survives by refusing, patiently and completely, to let anyone convince one of its members that the others are the enemy. The dice cup was never really about dice. It was only ever the smallest possible practice for the largest possible loyalty, and I intend to see it passed on fairly played for as many winters as I am given.